As we enter into the 1900s, Imperial Russia is under the absolute control of the Tsar. And a Tsar, an analogous term, would be emperor. He has absolute control over Russia, and he's part of the Romanov dynasty. Romanov dynasty that has had control, that has ruled over Imperial Russia since the early 1600s, so for roughly 300 years. But as we see from the late 1800s through the early 1900s, really over the course of Tsar Nicholas II's rule, you see ever increasing tensions between the ruling class, between the royalty and the aristocracy, and the labor class, sometimes called, referring themselves as the proletariat. The proletariat comes from, in Roman society, it was the lowest class, the people who are kind of doing the labor in Roman society, but they proudly referred to themselves as the proletariat. And as we'll see, the revolution that occurs in 1917, that's really the culmination of the struggle between the laborers, the ones that are working under ever increasingly harsh conditions in factories, in urban centers, or the ones that are working in the fields, and the ruling class. And this tension just keeps getting worse and worse and worse as we get into 1905. And 1905 is one of the more notable events that show that things aren't going all that well for the Tsar. In January of that year, you have an Orthodox priest leading a strike, leading a protest, trying to get, this is in St. Petersburg, trying to march to the Tsar's palace. And it's an unarmed, it's a peaceful protest, but they want to be heard. They want to explain to the Tsar how hard the working conditions are for laborers in Imperial Russia. And the Tsar isn't actually in town at the time, but his forces actually open fire on these peaceful protesters. And that event in which there's all these casualties of these peaceful protesters is called Bloody Sunday. And this was in January. Bloody Sunday, which is in January of 1905. And this sparks an attempted revolution where people who are sympathetic to those protesters, they start taking to the street throughout Russia. You start having government forces suppressing them wherever they are. But eventually that revolution is put down. It's an unsuccessful revolution, but it increases the tension even further. And frankly, even folks who might have been somewhat sympathetic to the Tsar before, almost viewed him as a bit of a father figure, now are thinking, hey, this guy's forces opened fire on peaceful protesters. Maybe he's really not on our side. And those tensions continue to increase as we go all the way into 1914, which we've seen in other videos, is the start of World War I. And like happens, and we've seen it in both World War I and World War II, Russia tends to take the brunt of these things. And World War I is incredibly difficult on Russia. First of all of a good fraction of the young men have to go fight. Then a lot of the economy has to be repointed at supporting the war effort, at the supplies for the troops, the food for the troops. And so it starts to really hurt the conditions for the average person, which were already bad. Remember, they were protesting in 1905, and now things are getting worse as we go through World War I for the average individual. Now, to make a bit of a concession to the general public and to move somewhat into a more representative world, after the revolution of 1905, the Tsar does create the Duma, which is a representative assembly that didn't have a ton of power, but it did start to give the people voice. And every time they assembled a Duma, the Tsar was actually not too pleased with it. He's like, who are all of these people who seem to be very aggressively anti-me? And he kept getting the Duma dissolved, and then a new Duma would be elected. And this kept going on and on and on, all the way until we get to the beginning of World War I. Now, as I said, World War I, conditions start to get worse. People start to get even more skeptical of Tsar rule. To make things even worse, when Tsar Nicholas II has left St. Petersburg to really help lead the troops, or in his mind, lead the troops near the front of the war, the country, or the empire, really goes under the control of his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra. And she is heavily under the influence of this gentleman right over here, Gregory Rasputin. And Rasputin is one of these fascinating characters from history because he was this mystical faith healer type guy who was able to really manipulate the Tsarina and to some degree the Tsar. And so people started getting suspicious of, well, who is this guy, this mysterious guy who's hanging out in the palace and seeming to have very strong influence over our rulers? And they were even suspicious suspicious of the Tsarina. At this time, a lot of the royalty, they married between countries. And the Tsarina, she was actually born in Germany, and her father was German. She grew up in Germany, and her grandmother was actually Queen Victoria of England. And you might remember that Russia is now at war with Germany. So they're like, hey, we have this German Tsarina essentially controlling the country under the sway of this mysterious, shady figure, Gregory Rasputin. People do not like the way that this is going. And so by 1917, things come to a head. And in February and especially March of 1917, they are able to force the Tsar to abdicate, to say, hey, enough is enough. We're taking it straight to you. You have to give up your power. And it's called the February Revolution, but the Tsar doesn't actually abdicate until March. So you could argue that you could call it the March Revolution. Now, once the Tsar abdicates, you have a provisional government. You have a provisional government take control. And all of this is happening in 1917. But people are also not happy with this provisional government. Remember, the war is continuing to go on. It's not really looking that well for Russia. They're continuing to lose people. The economy is continuing to tank. And what you have is workers start to assemble, start to organize in the various cities, and they form these workers' councils. These councils, and the word in Russian for them is Soviets. These Soviets start to form. And you fast forward into October of that year, and these Soviets are able to, along with the Bolsheviks, which is a party, are able to force the provisional government to abdicate its power or to give up its power. And then you have the control by a Soviet council. And in the Soviet council, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, are the ones who are actually able to take power. Now, revolutions, I mentioned, revolutions they're the culmination of decades of increasing tension. And as we've seen multiple times in history, revolutions are not clean things. It's not like the Tsar abdicates or the government abdicates and another government takes over and then everyone's all nice. The Bolshevik Revolution, which now has this Council of Soviets, where the Bolsheviks are in control, led by Vladimir Lenin, you can imagine the people who are loyal to the king, the monarchists, they're not happy. You can imagine people who are more aligned with capitalist models of government, because the Soviets and the Bolsheviks, they're strongly socialist. They're followers of Marx. They imagine an ideal state that has very limited private property rights, and on and on and on. And so this sparks the Russian Civil War, which lasts from 1917 to 1922. And like most civil wars, it is incredibly bloody. You have 2 to 3 million casualties. 2 to 3 million casualties as part of that civil war. And casualties, those could be deaths, those could be injuries. But in the end, the Bolshevik Red Army is victorious. And sometimes that civil war is viewed as a conflict between the Red Army of the Bolsheviks, the one that favored socialism, extreme socialism, communism really, and the White Army, the army that was either on the side of the monarchists or they're more capitalist, but they're definitely against the Red Army. And there's also another group, the Green Army, which is, not aligned with either one of them. So let me write this down. It's really, the Civil War is Red Army versus White Army versus White Army, and then there's even the notion of a Green Army, which is not aligned with either of these, versus the Green Army. And this continues all the way through 1922 until the Red Army is able to be victorious. And that's really the official start of the Soviet Union in 1922. And Lenin is the first premier of the Soviet Union. So he is the premier of the Soviet Union, but he does not last long. He eventually dies from natural causes a few years later in 1924, where he is followed by Stalin. And you might be asking, well, what happened to the Tsar and his family after they abdicated? Well, it's not that great of an outcome, and it's at least for them. And it's one of these famous things in history where his entire family his entire family actually gets executed the summer after he abdicates. And so this was an entire family. Every member of his family was executed. There were some theories that his daughter right over here, Anastasia, might have actually escaped, but it was later conclusively proven that she too was also executed. So you see that right over here, the Tsar abdicating in 1917, and then the next summer his entire family is actually executed. So it's a bloody beginning. It's a bloody period, but this is kind of what happens when you have significant revolutions.